Welcome to this installment of Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is Nicole O'Byrne. Today I have the privilege of speaking with Donald Savoie about his book, Louis J. Robichaud, A Man for the Moment, published by McGill Queen's University Press. Donald is the author of several books about Canadian politics, including Speaking Truth to Canadians about their public service and Governing from the Centre, the concentration of power in Canadian politics. Donald holds the Clément Cormier Research Chair in Regional Development at the Université de Moncton. He is the recipient of several honorary doctorates. He's a member of the Royal Society of Canada and is a companion of the Order of Canada. Donald, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss your book.
Well, Nicole, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
You've written numerous books about public administration, public policy, and government. Why have you turned your attention to writing political biography? Perhaps I should start by asking you to tell our listeners why Louis Robichaud was arguably one of the most important Canadian premiers of the 20th century.
Well, there's no question that Louis Robichaud was. If you go back to 1959, the province of New Brunswick was backwards in many, many ways, both economically, politically, socially. And so he came in with an incredible fire in his belly. And he was not for turning. He had single-minded purpose, and he decided to transform the province of New Brunswick. And he did so. He changed just about every sector in the province, from education to healthcare to social services. So the impact he had on New Brunswick was incredible. We talk about a quiet revolution in the province of Quebec in the 1960s. In New Brunswick, it was a revolution, and it wasn't that quiet.
How did Louis Robichaud's leadership transform New Brunswick from an inward-looking province into a modern society with strong political and educational institutions?
Well, when he came to power, we had some very conservative governments. I don't mean conservative in a partisan way. I mean, they didn't risk much. A major project was a small dam, Beechwood Dam on the St. John River. That was a major project back then. They didn't deal with Ottawa very effectively. The status quo prevailed. We had some pretty competent premiers in the past, Hugh John Fleming, Bicknell, and so on, but they didn't think they had the resources or the fire in the belly to take on the status quo as much as Louis did. So Louis came in and said, look, I've got to change this province. I've got to make sure that every New Brunswicker has an equal opportunity. And so to do that, he literally had to change the government of New Brunswick in a substantial fashion and change every sector in the province in a substantial fashion, and he did.
What were the key reforms introduced by Robichaud's government, and how did they address the historical intolerance and disparities faced by Acadians and other minority groups in New Brunswick?
Well, in 1960, Acadians did not have a university. We were 40% of the population. We ended school at grade 8. I was in Moncton. 1/3 of the population was French-speaking. I had to go to a private school because there was just no school in French beyond grade 8. There was no university. There was some classical colleges dotted along the coastline of New Brunswick. So Louis decided to change that fundamentally. And so he introduced a major reform package in the Department of Education so that we had some comprehensive high schools everywhere in the province. The University of Moncton was established. And you asked about sort of minority groups. Yes, Louis, there's no question that Acadians benefited greatly from Louis Robichaud's programs, but he often told me and told others that it was not just about Acadians. It was about equal opportunity everywhere in New Brunswick. So there was a major shift that had to take place between urban and rural parts of the province. He felt that rural parts of the province were being held back because we had a level of taxation that favored cities. And so he took on the taxation system, the education system, the welfare system, the economic development strategy, and on it goes.
In the book, you mentioned the infamous phrase, robbing Peter to pay Pierre. Why was the program of equal opportunity deemed so controversial by people such as Casey Irving and the very outspoken editor of the Fredericton Daily Gleaner, Michael Wardell?
Well, because it challenged the status quo. There's no question about that. Wardell, there's a bit of a side story here. I recall asking Louis Robichaud about Wardell. He was very much anti-French, anti-Acadian. He was a bigot, and it became visible, highly visible. And I once asked Louis, is Michael Wardell still alive? And Louis said, no, he waited too long to die, him. And so that was his view. Louis was never in the habit of denigrating people. He didn't. There's a couple of things about Louis Robichaud. He didn't swear. It was remarkable. I don't think I ever heard him say the F word, and he never denigrated people except Wardell, because Wardell went to the heart of what Louis was trying to do. Louis wanted to change the province from A to Z, and Wardell wanted the status quo to prevail. So there was a clash of ideas, clash of personalities, and in the end, Robichaud won.
Yeah, Michael Wardell sponsored a series of editorial cartoons by an artist by the last name of Worthman. And one of those cartoons had Louis Robichaud dressed up as a king with his head with a guillotine coming down, right? I found those cartoons in the archives soon after I moved to New Brunswick, and I got a good sense of how heated the controversy was with respect to equal opportunity. Your book does a very good job of getting inside some of that controversy. So, my next question is, why do you claim that the 1967 election, so after equal opportunity has started, it's got momentum, the 1967 election is called, you claim that it was arguably the most important election in the history of the province? And I'm particularly interested in the role played by Conservative leader Charlie Van Horn.
Well, it was clearly the most important election because equal opportunity had been launched. It was debated, very heated debate in the assembly, in the media. There was strong opposition to it, but it had been introduced. The legislation had been passed. But there's no question, had Louis lost the election to Charlie Van Horn, the equal opportunity program would have been thrown out the window. The implementation would not have taken place. And Louis knew that. He knew it was a pivotal election, that his program of equal opportunity hung on the election. And he fought it with great passion and emotion. There's all kinds of stories about the 67 election. For example, in Acadian in northern New Brunswick, there was a crowd of about 3,000 or 4,000 people in a hall that could hold about 1,200. So there was no way to get him to the stage. So Acadians put him up on their shoulder and passed him on to the next person until he got to the stage and spoke. And it was just an incredibly emotional. And since the book has been published, I've heard from people from up north telling me that they were there at that campaign stop. And so it was an extremely heated campaign. It was a very tight campaign. At first, the betting people were that Charlie was going to win. Charlie was from northern New Brunswick, Campbellton. He was fluently bilingual. I think his mother was an Acadian. He spoke French with great ease. He was a showman. He worked for Casey Irving. He had the resources to take on Louis. It was a bitterly fought election, and the stakes were extremely high. The program was either going to survive or fall by the wayside if Louis should lose that election.
I'm originally from Saskatchewan. I moved here in 2009 to work at the University of New Brunswick. My dissertation, my PhD, I examined various aspects of the Tommy Douglas administration in Saskatchewan. When I moved to New Brunswick, I was delighted to discover that many of the senior civil servants from the Douglas era moved to New Brunswick in the 1960s to help restructure the bureaucracy and actually implement this vision of equal opportunity. Could you tell us about some of the reforms that Donald Tansley and the other members of this so-called mafia, they call them the Saskatchewan Mafia, what did they implement in New Brunswick?
Well, a great deal. If you recall, you're from Saskatchewan, you know that Ross Thatcher won the election and he turned on the public service. Louis Robichaud told others that he wanted the most competent public servant to serve. He was not interested in knowing if they were Liberal or Conservatives or NDP. That was irrelevant to him. What he wanted was competence. Now, he was launching programs in the public service in New Brunswick up until 1960 was pretty weak. It was a series of clerks doing what they were told to do. When he came in and launched these ambitious programs, and I'm talking about Medicare, I'm talking about education and so on, he needed skilled people to make sure that the implementation phase would go on smoothly. So yes, he went to Saskatchewan, and yes, Don Tansley, Graham Clarkson, Don Junk, a whole bunch of them came, and they were named the Saskatchewan Mafia. They did remarkable work. Without the Saskatchewan Mafia, I'm not sure the Equal Opportunity Program would have taken flight. Graham, sort of an aside story, Graham Clarkson was Deputy Minister of Health, and he was very much a professional. didn't understand partisan politics much. Louis didn't push that on him. But when the government changed, somebody from Newcastle, Chatham, barged into his office and said, "We need a hospital in Newcastle." And Graham Carson said, "Who in the hell are you?" And the chap said, "Well, I'm a pole captain." And Graham Clarkson said, "I don't care if you're a pole general. Just get out of my office." So that was, now Graham Clarkson left shortly after that, but the Saskatchewan Mafia, as we call them, as you refer to them, played a pivotal role in the implementation of equal opportunity. Now, after 1970, when Louis lost the election, a lot of them went to Ottawa and became very, very competent mandarins. Don Tansley became a deputy minister of fisheries and oceans, and a lot of them followed suit. So they were a very competent group that came and actually played an important role in making sure that the programs and the policies that Louis wanted to launch would be well implemented.
In 2011, I had the opportunity to interview Fred Drummy. And I went down to St. Stephen, and he says, I've been waiting 20 years for someone from the university to come talk to me about equal opportunity. And luckily, I had brought my toothbrush because I ended up staying overnight. He had so many things to say and so many documents to show me. Now, of course, Fred worked in the Office of Government Organization. And he told me that the Saskatchewan Mafia did great work, as you've just described, but that a lot of New Brunswickers were involved in equal opportunity as well. So I'd like to ask you about some of the New Brunswickers that you knew who were involved in this big overhaul and change in direction in the New Brunswick government.
Well, let's start with Fred Drummy. I too got to know Fred Drummy well. I saw him in St. Andrews on several occasions. Actually, Fred Drummy is the one that got the Saskatchewan Mafia to come down. He played a pivotal role. He told me how he did it. He went to an IPAC conference, I think, and he met a number of public servants from Saskatchewan that are looking for new challenges, and he said, "Come on in." There's no question about that. I asked Fred Drummy once if Louis Robichaud understood fully what he was launching. And Fred answered me, I'll never forget his answer. He said he knew exactly what he was doing. And he said, and I quote, "I've never seen a politician with as much guts as Louis Robichaud." And so you're right, the Saskatchewan Mafia played a pivotal role. But because of them, they became role model. And there's a number of New Brunswickers that became excellent public servants. I'm thinking of Nick Mulder, who worked under the Saskatchewan Mafia, learned from them, had a distinguished career in the government of Brunswick, and then went on to become the Deputy Minister of Transport in the federal government. So the Saskatchewan Mafia had an important impact, not just in making sure that the policies and program were being well implemented, but also in acting as mentor in helping younger New Brunswickers become a strong public servant.
You were a close friend of Louis Robichaud's for many years. Your insight into his character adds fascinating layers to the biography. How did you balance your subjective knowledge and your friendship with Robichaud with the historical record?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I thank you for it because I wrestled with it. Louis Robichaud and I became very good friends. I recall the day when he called me to his home in Bouctouche, and I went in. He was sitting in that chair with a blanket, had lost a lot of weight, and said, "I have a favor to ask you." And I said, "Sure, Louis." "What?" He said, "Can you organize my funeral?" And I had to tell you, that really shook me up. And I said, I wanted to say, "Louis, no. We are going to fight. There's new medicine, so on." But I knew Louis well enough that he wouldn't have any of that nonsense. So I did organize his funeral. It was a very cold day in January. I'll never forget. I struggled with that question, and I answered it by saying, no, I'm not going to be objective. I'm not going to try to write a book like Governing from the Center. No, I'm going to write, and people who have read the book have told me it's a different Donald Savoie. One of them said, "Well, we finally get to know who you are." So it became very emotional for me because I had to tell you, I really liked the guy. He played an important role. Without him, I wouldn't be where I am today, and many Acadians would not be where they are today. So for me, he was an extremely important player in my province, and a great friend. I enjoyed him. We played golf together quite a bit. He was a delight. And so, to answer your question, no, I'm not objective, and I don't pretend to be. And in the preface of the book, I said, folks, if you want to read something negative about Robichaud, go somewhere else. This is not the book for you. And so I tell the story as I see it. You know, my father started a business in 1957. I was just a young kid, very young. I remember going to Louis' house because he's the one that incorporated my father's business. So there were family ties to Louis Robichaud. We became very close friends. So I had no pretensions whatsoever that this is any kind of an objective book.
Well, tell me more about your relationship with Louis Robichaud, because personally, I found that those insights were just riveting. It's a real page turner, and there's so much information there that I had never seen anywhere else. And I've spent a lot of time in the archives, but that dry kind of policy history or whatnot, you bring it to life because you know all the people involved. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about his impact on your life.
Well, Louis, again, he and I spent a lot of time with him. We went for lunch, and he came to my office often. And my assistant was from Tracadie. And every time that Louis Robichaud came to my office, she, for her and for many Acadians, Louis was a kind of a rock star. And when I would tell her, when he comes in, she would always put on a fine dress and she'd bring him a coffee. She never brought me a coffee once, but Louis was different. And I recall one time, some of my friends would say, Louis would come to see you. You'd shut the door. What the hell did you talk about? And I said, I don't remember. We talked about hockey, golf, whatever, what friends talk about. We didn't have any plans to do anything more than that. We were just friends. His career was pretty well done, and I enjoyed his company, and we had fun. One day he came in to see me, and we had coffee and chatted and so on. After he left, my assistant came in and said, there's something wrong with Louis. I said, no, fine. No, she said, there's something not quite right. 10 days later, he came back to see me and he said, I just been in for my first treatment for cancer. I said, Louis, geez, when did you hear that? 10 days before. So my assistant saw it. I didn't. So I called her in. I said, how in the heck did you know? She said, I'm a woman and you're a man. You wouldn't pick up those things. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. But he had an incredible impact on all of us. And there was something jovial about him. He has guts galore, but there was always a side of him that enjoyed life, enjoyed playing golf. He wasn't very good at it, and I wasn't very good at it, but we had a heck of a good time. He loved to talk. He loved to talk about the University of Moncton, because for him, that was the crown jewel. He often told me, and he told others, that's the accomplishment that he enjoyed to watch and to see. The only instructions he gave me in organizing his funeral, he said, could you make sure it's on the campus of the University of Moncton? And I did. He was not just Acadians. I mean, people from Charlotte County adored him as well. I remember one day walking on campus with Louis. I don't know why we were there, but we were walking. And this gentleman stopped me and said, that's Louis Robichaud. I said, yes. He said, do you think my 12 or 13-year-old son could shake hands with him? I said, of course. Why not? So I asked Louis. Louis was a bit shy, by the way. People don't know that. But so he came over, shook hands. And after, the chap was from Sussex, New Brunswick, an Anglophone, and he told me, I want someday for my son to be able to say that he shook hands with Louis Robichaud. So Louis had an impact throughout the province. People who felt sort of disenfranchised saw in him the way ahead. They saw in him an opportunity to go to school, to go to grade 12, to go to university, to start a business. So he literally transformed the province. I saw that in him. When he retired from the Senate, he came back to Moncton and came back to this region, I should say. And we did spend a lot of time. There's a famous restaurant here in Moncton. It's called Little Louis. It's the nicest, priciest restaurant in Moncton, so on. And we went for dinner there once, and I said, Louis, I think this restaurant was named after you. Yeah, I don't know. So I went and asked, and they said, yes, the owner of the restaurant was a big fan of Louis Robichaud, and he named the restaurant after Louis. So I went back and told Louis, I said, this restaurant is named after you. He said, well, I didn't know. That's okay. The food's pretty good. So he had no desired to be told or to accept that his name would be employed in setting up a restaurant. He was a very modest person. He had a clear purpose in mind. He never drew any economic benefits from being premier. He was never a lobbyist. He never played his card as premier to get a number of things. He just served in the old traditional way of a politician serving the public interest. That was Louis Robichaud, and that's what I admired in him.
Louis Robichaud was premier from 1960 to 1970. He lost the 1970 election to a very colorful conservative named Richard Hatfield, who served as premier of New Brunswick from 1970 to 1987. I'd like to know, in your opinion, to what extent did Richard Hatfield, even though he was a conservative, carry on the legacy of equal opportunity and the vision of Louis Robichaud?
I can tell you that, and Louis told me that on more than one occasion, he really liked Richard Hatfield. They became good friends. Hatfield appreciated what Louis did, and to Hatfield's credit, he never tried to undo Robichaud's equal opportunity program, never tried to undo what Louis did. He just went on his way and did his own policy agenda. And so Richard Hatfield was able to win the support of a number of Acadians precisely because he left intact a lot of what Louis sought to do in the province of New Brunswick. And again, there was a fair degree of friendship between Louis and Hatfield. Louis told me more than once, if I had to lose the election, better to lose to Richard Hatfield. I don't think he would have appreciated losing to Charlie Van Horn. But to Hatfield, he was quite comfortable with that.
Yeah, it's a different time in politics, isn't it? So, my last question for you is, you make a very compelling case that Robichaud was indeed a man for the moment, as the title of your book claims. In what ways can Robichaud's political ambition, wisdom, and vision serve as a model for today's politicians and civil servants in Canada?
Well, Nicole, I'm not sure. Again, that's a very nice question. I appreciate it. And I've reflected on that question. I'm not sure we could have another Louis Robichaud. I don't think the circumstances are there for Louis Robichaud. Let me explain. We don't trust government. We don't trust politicians like we used to. We've added layers upon layers upon layers of oversight bodies. Even in a small province like the province of New Brunswick, I think we have something like 8 agents of the Legislative Assembly. In Ottawa, we have officers of Parliament. I think we're up to 11. These people and their staff go to work every morning trying to find something wrong inside government. Louis only had one. He only dealt with one. I think social media has a lot to answer for. You have bozo eruptions all over the place. There's no editorial control of any kind. Louis knew who he was fighting, how he promoted his agenda, who was for it and who was against it. It's less clear now. Government has become so complex, so complicated that things don't move quickly. Look, when Louis was premier, he wanted a massive program of equal opportunity. Within 4 or 5 years, it was a done deal. Today, if you take the environment, for example, when you want to move, Ottawa has about 140 programs, 10 provinces, the global partners when you deal in terms of the environment. So you move very, very, very slowly. I know that the Prime Minister Carney is trying to move a number of projects. It's slow, it's painfully slow because we made government painfully slow. Louis didn't have to deal with that. Louis' force of personality could move things, could get the public servants to come and say, do this. He told me once that a senior minister went to see him and said, Louis, I've got a problem. I don't know what to do with it. And Louis said, well, look, I believe in you. I think you're up to the job. I know the deputy minister. I appointed the person there. He's very competent. Go back and sort it out. You're the minister. That wouldn't happen today. If a minister runs into a problem, they run to the premier's office or prime minister's office, and those offices kind of take over. And so the force of personality that Louis needed, not just in his own office, but in terms of the public service from Saskatchewan, in terms of key ministers, that's not readily available anymore. And we don't have the kind of media that we have. I still read the sort of traditional media, But people around me, the younger generation, they get their news on Facebook. Well, I don't even know how to get there. And so a politician today has to deal with enormous challenges, enormous sort of constraints that Louis did not have to. And Louis could define an agenda and tell New Brunswickers, this is important for you, this is important for the province of New Brunswick, this is important for my government, and I'm moving ahead, we are going to do this. So buckle up, we're moving. I don't think we can do that anymore. And so, the moment was right for Louis Robichaud to come in with his ambitious programs, because Ottawa was trying to move in with federal provincial money, and Louis knew how to grab that money. And so the moment was right for Louis Robichaud, and he came and he met it. Today, I don't know what moment that a politician would be dealing with. It's a very different world. It's much more complicated, much more difficult.
I'd like to ask one more question. I'll sneak this in here. I think we've got a couple more minutes. To what extent was Louis Robichaud influenced by his education at Laval? How did his teachers at Laval impact the way he thought about what government could do?
Well, you've been doing a lot of reading yourself. Yes, he was very influenced by that. So was Jean Lesage. So was Jean Pelletier. So were many of that era. They studied under Father Levac, and Father Levac was very much an activist. And he, if you recall, or people may recall, that in the 1950s, Maurice Duplessis was a reactionary. In Quebec, he was premier and dominated by the Roman Catholic Church and so on. And even though a priest, Levac said, look, there's things that government needs to do, there's things that government can do. And in order for Quebec to prosper and Canada to prosper, governments have to move in and get things done. Louis studied under Father Levac. In fact, Father Levac said many times after, he became a good friend of Louis. And so in many ways, Father Levac was his mentor. In many ways, Father Levac showed Louis what good government was capable of doing. And Louis learned that lesson. And he did it because when he came back to New Brunswick, what Father Levac said could be done had yet to be done, had yet to be even tried. So he did that. Now, there's a bit of a story I'd like to tell. Louis has a sister, Rita Mayet. I saw her not too long ago. She's 98 years old. She's a firecrack. And so when she finished grade 6, she was determined to go to school. But in Acadian villages, you couldn't. But she was told that if she called Killimbikee in Buctos, she could go to school in Buctos. So in Saint Antoine, where Louis was from, where she was from, there was one telephone, the operator, just one telephone. She had never seen it before. So she went to the place and said, I would like to talk to Killimbikee in Buctos. The operator put her on. So she got to the phone. She started yelling, top of her lung, I want to go to school. And she thought that Buctos was so far away, there's no way a line could take her voice from Saint Antoine into Buctos. That's why she was yelling. And I was telling her, in your lifetime, you saw the telephone for the first time. And today we're looking at artificial intelligence and everything that comes with it. That's in one lifetime. Incredible amount of progress. Well, Louis Robichaud in the 1960s was a major part of that progress. He literally transformed the province of New Brunswick.
It's a fascinating story. Donald, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss your biography of Louis Robichaud. I highly recommend it to our listeners.
Well, Nicole, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
My guest today has been Donald Savoie. His biography, Louis J. Robichaud, A Man for the Moment, was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2026. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday. Please visit our website at www.champlainsociety.ca to learn more about the important work of the Champlain Society. And please feel free to share this podcast on social media. Reviews are always welcome. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring original documents in Canadian history to life. We would like to thank several Canadian scholarly book publishers, including the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press for their financial support. My name is Nicole O'Byrne. This interview was recorded on May 26, 2026. It was produced by Kevin Ball and supported by the University of Toronto Press Journal team.